When the Beatles were mid-performance at Shea Stadium in front of 65,000 screaming fans, John Lennon suddenly stopped playing and the entire stadium fell into dead silence, because a 7-year-old boy had just lost his mother in the crowd chaos. What happened next wasn't just captured on camera, but changed the lives of everyone who witnessed it that night. But here's what nobody talks about. What did John whisper to that terrified little boy that made 65,000 people spontaneously start crying? The summer heat pressed down on Shea Stadium like a suffocating blanket, but inside the concrete tunnels beneath the field, the air crackled with electric anticipation. August 15th, 1965. The screams from the massive crowd thundered through the walls, a sound so deafening it seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Workers in the concession stands had given up trying to communicate over the noise, resorting to hand gestures and written notes. Even the seasoned roadies, men who had worked with everyone from Elvis to Chuck Berry, stood slack-jawed at the sheer volume of human emotion pouring down from the stands above. In a cramped dressing room that smelled of sweat and cigarettes, 4 young men from Liverpool tried to prepare for what would become the largest concert in rock and roll history. The walls were thin here, and every few seconds another wave of screaming would crash over them like a physical force. John Lennon stood before a cracked mirror, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his guitar strap for the 3rd time. The familiar weight of his Rickenbacker felt heavier tonight, or maybe it was just the crushing pressure of what waited beyond those tunnel walls. His reflection stared back at him, pale, tired, but with eyes that still held that spark of rebellion that had carried them from the Cavern Club to this moment. The sound was unlike anything they'd experienced before, and they thought they'd experienced everything. The Ed Sullivan Theatre had been loud, but this was altogether unprecedented. A living, breathing entity of pure hysteria that seemed to have its own heartbeat, its own malevolent intelligence. Christ, listen to them, Paul muttered, pressing his ear against the concrete wall. Through the small window in their dressing room, they could see fragments of the crowd, a sea of faces crushed against the railings that were already beginning to bend and sway under the pressure of bodies pushing forward, desperate to get closer to their idols. Police officers moved through the crowd like ships in a storm, their expression tense with worry, knowing they were barely maintaining control. Teenagers were fainting and being carried away by medics who had to fight their way through the packed stands. Parents clutched their children closer, some beginning to regret bringing them to what was turning into something more like a religious revival than a concert. George sat in the corner of the dressing room, methodically tuning his guitar, his jaw clenched in concentration. At 22, he was still the quiet Beatle, but tonight the atmosphere was beyond anything they'd encountered. The weight of expectation hung in the air like smoke from 1,000 cigarettes. Ringo drummed his fingers against his leg in a nervous rhythm, his usual easy smile replaced by something more serious, more uncertain. They'd played to big crowds before, but never anything like this. This felt dangerous. Through the chaos of roadies running past their door, through the distant roar that never seemed to stop, John caught a glimpse of something that made his stomach tighten. In the crowd, visible from their tiny window, pinned to the front row, was a small boy, 7 years old, clutching a Beatles program against his chest. The kid had tear-stained cheeks. The tunnel to the stage stretched before them like a corridor to another world, and as they walked toward the light, each step felt heavier than the last. John's mind wandered to Julian, his 3-year-old son back in England, probably asleep in his crib while his father prepared to face a crowd larger than most cities. How had they gotten here? 2 years ago, they were nobody. Now they were prisoners of their own success, living in hotel rooms and hiding from the very people who claimed to love them. Paul wiped his palms on his jacket, trying to shake off the familiar tightness in his chest that had been plaguing him during performances lately. The panic attacks had started small, just a flutter of anxiety before going on stage, but they were getting worse. Sometimes he felt like he couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in around him. He'd never told the others. How could he? They needed him to be the optimist, the one who kept them moving forward when everything felt like it might fall apart. "Remember when we could actually hear ourselves play?" George said quietly, his voice barely audible over the crowd noise that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. He'd been questioning everything lately. The screaming fans who didn't listen to the music, the endless touring that left no time for growth, the way fame had transformed them from musicians into something else entirely. Sometimes he wondered if the music even mattered anymore, or if they'd become nothing more than objects for people to project their fantasies onto. Ringo, ever the steady one, noticed the tension radiating from his bandmates. He'd always been the glue that held them together, the one who could lighten the mood with a joke or a funny face. But tonight, even his usual optimism felt strained. The pressure of entertaining the sea of humanity wasn't just about playing the songs anymore. It was about living up to an impossible standard, being more than human for people who needed them to be everything. The sound grew louder as they approached the stage entrance, and through the gap in the curtains, they could see the massive crowds spread out before them like an ocean of desperate faces. The stadium lights cast everything in harsh relief, creating a surreal landscape of reaching hands and tear-streaked cheeks. Police officers formed thin lines between sections, their looks strained and anxious with the knowledge that they were barely maintaining control. John paused at the curtain's edge and looked out at the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces below. Somewhere in that mass of humanity were real people with real lives, real problems, real pain. They weren't just screaming teenagers. They were daughters and sisters, sons and brothers. They were kids who needed something to believe in, something to give them hope in a world that often felt hopeless. And for some reason, they'd chosen 4 working-class lads from Liverpool to fill that void. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy coat. In a few moments they would step out onto that stage and become the Beatles again, the smiling, waving, perfect pop stars. But right now, in this moment before the transformation, they were still just John, Paul, George and Ringo. Still just human beings about to face something that defied human comprehension. The opening chords of Twist and Shout cut through the night air like lightning, but the sound was immediately swallowed by a wall of screams so intense it seemed to have physical weight. John's fingers moved across the fretboard by muscle memory alone. There was no way to hear anything above the cacophony. Paul's bass line thumped through the massive amplifiers, more felt than heard, while George's lead guitar disappeared entirely into the sonic chaos. Ringo's drum beat became a heartbeat for 65,000 people who had collectively lost their minds. The stage lights blazed down on them, turning everything beyond the first few rows into a shimmering haze of movement and sound. John squinted into the crowd, trying to make sense of the sea of faces that stretched endlessly before them. Bodies pressed against barriers that bent and swayed under the pressure. Police officers moved frantically along the edges, their voices lost in the din as they tried to maintain some semblance of order. This wasn't a concert anymore. It was something primal, something that transcended music and became pure emotional release. Halfway through the second verse, John noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A security guard was pushing through the crowd of roadies at the side of the stage, his face urgent, almost panicked. The man was waving frantically, trying to catch someone's attention. John tried to ignore him, the show must go on after all, but something about the guard's desperation cut through his professional focus. The guard reached the stage edge and started gesturing wildly at John, his mouth moving in words that were completely lost to the noise. John leaned closer, still playing, still maintaining the facade of the performance, but his concentration was split. The man cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted something, his face red with effort. John caught fragments. Lost. Mother. Hospital. 7 years old. Without thinking, John's hand came up in a sharp gesture, and the music ground to a halt. Paul's bass notes hung in the air for a moment before he too stopped playing, confusion written across his face. George's guitar fell silent, and Ringo's drumsticks froze mid-beat. For the first time since they'd taken the stage, there was something approaching quiet, though the packed stadium didn't stop making noise all at once. The crowd's energy shifted from ecstatic to confused. Voices called out in the darkness beyond the lights. Someone screamed John's name. Another voice shouted for them to keep playing. But John wasn't hearing any of it. He was focused entirely on the security guard, who was now close enough to be heard. "There's a boy," the guard said, his voice hoarse from shouting. 7 years old, lost his mother in the crowd. She collapsed. They took her to the hospital. Kid's been crying for 20 minutes. We can't calm him down. The guard's eyes were pleading. He just keeps asking for his mum and asking why the Beatles stopped playing. John felt the world narrow to a single point of focus. Somewhere in that massive crowd was a child, a little boy no older than Julian would be in a few years, terrified and alone, surrounded by strangers who were too caught up in their own hysteria to notice his pain. The security guard pointed toward a section near the front, and John squinted into the lights until he saw him, a small figure squeezed against the dividers, tears catching the stage lights like tiny diamonds. The boy was clutching something against his chest, a Beatles program that was now crumpled from his desperate grip. His mouth was open in a cry that would never be heard above the crowd noise, and his eyes, wide with terror and confusion, were looking directly at the stage, looking directly at John. In that moment, everything else fell away. The crowd, the pressure, the performance, the carefully constructed image of the Beatles. There was only a frightened child who needed help, and 4 men who suddenly remembered what it felt like to be human. John's decision came without hesitation. The performance could wait. Time seemed suspended in that moment of silence, as if the entire stadium was holding its breath. John set his guitar down with deliberate care and walked to the edge of the stage, his movements slow and purposeful. The crowd's confusion rippled outward like waves, voices calling out questions that no one could answer. Paul stepped up beside him, and without words they communicated what needed to happen next. "Ladies and gentlemen," Paul's voice rang out through the stadium's PA system, cutting through the murmur of 65,000 confused fans. His Liverpool accent was thick with emotion as he continued, "We need to take care of something important right now." The crowd began to quiet, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. "There's a little boy in the audience who's lost his mum and we're going to help him." The security guard helped lift the boy, Tommy, they learned later, over the barrier and onto the stage. He was smaller than he'd appeared from a distance, 7 years old with unruly brown hair and eyes red from crying. His Beatles program was clutched so tightly in his small fist that his knuckles had gone white. When he reached the stage, he stood frozen, overwhelmed by the enormous gathering that surrounded him on all sides. John walked over slowly, the way he might approach a frightened animal. He knelt down until he was at eye level with the boy, his knees touching the cold stage floor. The stadium lights cast harsh shadows across his face, but his eyes were gentle as he looked at Tommy. "What's your name, love?" he asked, his voice soft enough that only the boy could hear, though the microphones caught every word and broadcast it to the silent crowd. "Tommy," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible even through the sound system. "I can't find my mum. They said she went to the hospital, but I don't know where that is." His lower lip trembled and his face grew wet from renewed crying. John reached out slowly and placed a gentle hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Well, Tommy, my name's John. These are my friends, Paul, George, and Ringo." He gestured to the others, who had moved closer, creating a protective circle around the boy. "And we're going to make sure you're okay. That's a promise." George knelt down beside John, his usual shyness forgotten in the face of the child's distress. "That's a brilliant Beatles program you've got there," he said quietly. "Have you been a fan for long?" Tommy nodded, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Since I was 5, he managed to say. "My mum bought me all your records." Paul crouched down too, completing the circle. The image was striking. 4 of the most famous people in the world, literally on their knees, giving their complete attention to one small boy, while the entire crowd watched in absolute silence. Ringo, still behind his drums, leaned forward on his stool, his face creased with concern. "Tommy," John said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I want you to have something." He pulled out his harmonica, the same one he'd played on Love Me Do, their first hit record. "This is very special to me, but I think it should belong to someone very brave, and you're the bravest boy I've ever met." He placed the harmonica gently in Tommy's palm. "When you play this, you'll remember that you've got friends who care about you." The boy's eyes went wide as he stared at the instrument in his hand. "Really? For me?" John nodded, and for the first time since he'd been brought on stage, Tommy smiled. A small, tentative thing, but genuine. What happened next was something that would be talked about for decades. Paul stood up and addressed the crowd again. "Tommy's mum is at the hospital and she's going to be fine," he announced, though they had no way of knowing if that was true. "But right now, Tommy needs to know that he's not alone. Can everyone help me show Tommy that this entire stadium cares about him?" The response started as a gentle murmur, but quickly grew into something extraordinary. Instead of screaming, the crowd began to chant Tommy's name, softly at first, then building into a warm, embracing sound that seemed to wrap around the boy like a blanket. Some people were crying, not the hysterical tears of fandom, but genuine tears of empathy for a child who had touched their hearts. Tommy looked out at the ocean of humanity, no longer terrifying but somehow comforting, all focused on him with love and concern. He raised his small hand and waved, and the gentle roar that followed was unlike anything the stadium had ever heard. Not screaming, but something closer to a collective embrace. The Beatles finished their set that night, but the music felt different somehow. That crowd listened as much as they screamed, and when John introduced each song, he would look down at Tommy, who had been given a place of honour at the side of the stage with a security guard and a social worker who had arrived to help reunite him with his mother. Years later, people who were there would say they could barely remember what songs the Beatles played that night. What they remembered was the moment when 4 superstars became 4 ordinary men who saw a child in need and dropped everything to help him. They remembered how it felt to be part of something larger than themselves, not just a crowd, but a community that could come together for one small boy named Tommy. That harmonica John gave him would become one of Tommy's most treasured possessions. But more than that, it became a symbol of something that music could be at its best. Not just entertainment, but a bridge between human hearts, a reminder that beneath all the noise and chaos and fame, we're all just people who need each other.